and again. I have had to pretend to show no interest in him. I have had to bear the unkindness of his sister and the rudeness of his mother without enjoying any of the advantages of an attachment to him. I know now that I shall be divided from Edward forever. If you can ever think me capable of feeling Marianne, surely you may suppose that I have suffered now." These words went straight to Marianne's heart. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "you have made me hate myself forever. How unkind I have been to you, you who have been my only comfort." And the two sisters fell sobbing into each other's arms. Marianne was so sorry she had misjudged her sister that she promised to do anything Eleanor wanted. To discuss the engagement in public without bitterness, to meet Lucy without showing any dislike, and even to talk to Edward himself, if chance brought them together, with her usual friendliness. The next morning brought a test of her self-control, when John Dashwood came to visit Mrs. Jennings and his sisters. "You have heard, I suppose," said he with a most serious expression, "of our very shocking discovery yesterday." Silently, they all showed that they had. It seemed too awful a moment to speak. "Your sister-in-law," he continued, "has suffered terribly. So too has Mrs. Ferrars, but I would not alarm you too greatly. The doctor says Fanny is strong and will get better in time. She says she will never think well of anybody again, and I cannot wonder at it, as she was so deceived. How ungrateful those young women were, after she had shown them so much kindness. I wish with all my heart, says poor Fanny in her affectionate way, that we had invited your sisters instead of them." Here he stopped to be thanked, then continued. "What poor Mrs. Ferrars suffered cannot be described. She could not believe Edward was secretly engaged, when all the time she had been planning a most excellent marriage for him. She sent for him, and he came to see her. I am sorry to tell you what happened next. All our attempts to persuade Edward to end the attachment were useless. Even when his mother explained that if he married Miss Morton, she would generously allow him £1,000 a year, and even when she offered to make it £1,200, he still insisted that he would not break the engagement. Mrs. Ferrars then told him he would receive no money at all from her, and if he entered any profession, she would do her best to prevent him succeeding in it." "Good heavens!" cried Marianne. "Can this be possible?" "Your surprise is very natural, Marianne," said her brother. "It is astonishing that Edward could not be persuaded." Marianne, about to disagree fiercely, remembered her promises to Eleanor, and said nothing. "Well," cried Mrs. Jennings, "I think he has behaved like an honest man. He must keep his promise to marry Lucy Steele. If he broke it, the world would think him a worthless scoundrel." "I respect your views, madam," said John Dashwood politely, "but I am afraid that a good, thoughtful mother like Mrs. Ferrars, with such a very large fortune, cannot approve of her son's secret engagement to this most unsuitable young woman. I am sorry to say that it has all ended in a most unhappy separation. Mrs. Ferrars told Edward to leave her house, and he obeyed at once. She does not wish to see him ever again, and has now decided very understandably that Robert, not Edward, should inherit her fortune when she dies. Poor Edward. His younger brother will be wealthy while he remains poor. I feel for him sincerely." John Dashwood left soon afterwards, and the three ladies immediately joined together in their firm disapproval of Mrs. Ferrars' behaviour and their warm praise of Edward's. The next morning, Eleanor received a letter from Lucy. "I hope, my dear Miss Dashwood, you will not mind my writing to you. I know that, as a true friend, you will be pleased to hear my news. Edward and I, although we have suffered terribly in all our recent troubles, are quite well now, thank God, and happy in each other's love. We are very grateful to our friends, yourself not the least among them, for helping us through our many difficulties. I shall always remember your great kindness, and so will Edward. I am sure you will be glad to hear that I spent 2 happy hours with him yesterday. I offered him his freedom, and was ready to consider our engagement at an end, if that was what he wanted. But he would not hear of it, and said he did not care about his mother's anger, as long as he had my affections. Life will not be easy for us, it is true, but we must wait and hope for the best. He will enter the church soon, and if you ever have the opportunity to recommend him to anybody who can give him a living, I am sure you will not forget us. And dear Mrs. Jennings, too. I hope she will say a good word for us to any friend who may be able to help us. I beg you to remember me to her most gratefully and respectfully, and to Sir John and Lady Middleton, and the dear children, and give my love to Miss Marianne. Yours truly, Lucy Steele. Eleanor felt sure that Lucy wanted the letter to be seen by Mrs. Jennings, and showed it to her immediately. Mrs. Jennings was full of praise for Lucy's warm heart. "How prettily she writes," she said. "She calls me dear Mrs. Jennings, you see. I wish I could get him a living with all my heart." The Miss Dashwoods had now been in London for more than 2 months, and Marianne was becoming more and more impatient to go home. She missed the air, the freedom, the quiet of the country. Eleanor, although almost as anxious to leave as her sister, was aware of the difficulties of a long journey. This problem appeared to be solved when the Palmers invited Mrs. Jennings and the Miss Dashwoods to their home in Somerset, only a day's journey away from Barton. They planned to travel there at the end of March. The invitation was gladly accepted. Eleanor and Marianne would stay a week with the Palmers, and then continue their journey to Barton. Soon after this arrangement had been made, Colonel Brandon called at Mrs. Jennings' house and was told the news. "My dear Colonel, I do not know what you and I will do without the Miss Dashwoods," said Mrs. Jennings. "How lonely and dull we shall be." She hoped these words, and the sad picture they painted, would persuade him to make the offer of marriage which might prevent any loneliness or dullness in the future. And with delight she saw that her plan had succeeded. When Eleanor moved to a quiet corner of the room, Colonel Brandon joined her there and talked very seriously to her for several minutes. Although Mrs. Jennings was too honourable to listen, she could not help seeing that Eleanor was blushing and looking agitated. Some of the Colonel's words reached Mrs. Jennings' ears and astonished her greatly. "I do apologise for the smallness of the house." What could he mean? She knew very well that there were 15 bedrooms and 5 sitting-rooms in his house at Delaford. "I am afraid it cannot happen soon." What an unlover-like thing to say! There could be no reason at all to delay their marriage. In fact, the Colonel was talking on a quite different subject. He had heard of Edward's difficulties, and, knowing him to be a friend of Eleanor's, wished to help the young man. A living at Delaford had just become vacant, and the Colonel was asking Eleanor to offer it to Edward. At least it would be a start for Mr. Ferrers. The vicar's duties there are light, and there is a cottage that goes with the post, although I do apologise for the smallness of the house. The income is only £200 a year, so I am afraid his marriage cannot happen very soon. Eleanor expressed her grateful thanks for the Colonel's generous offer and promised to tell Edward the good news. When Colonel Brandon had left, Mrs. Jennings spoke to Eleanor with a knowing smile. "Well, Miss Dashwood, I couldn't help overhearing the Colonel's words, and I can tell you I was never better pleased in my life." "Yes," said Eleanor, "it is a matter of great happiness to me, but I was so surprised when he spoke to me about it." "My dear, I am not in the least astonished by it. I wish you every happiness, and if I want to see a happy couple, I know where to look for them in the future." "At Delaford, I suppose," said Eleanor with a smile. "That's right, my dear, and I can tell you you won't find the house small. Now I must go out, but we'll continue our conversation later. I'm sure you want to tell your sister about it." "Certainly, madam. but I shall not mention it to anyone else at present." "Oh," said Mrs. Jennings, disappointed. "Then you would prefer me not to tell Charlotte, or Sir John, or Lucy?" "Yes, madam, if you don't mind. I must speak to Mr. Ferrers first to arrange matters with him." This was at first extremely puzzling for Mrs. Jennings, but after a moment's thought she had a happy idea. Edward must be the vicar they had chosen to carry out the wedding ceremony. She hurried excitedly off on her morning visits, aware of the important secret that she was not allowed to tell. By chance, as she left the house, she met Edward at the door. He had called only to leave a note, but Mrs. Jennings insisted on his going in to see Miss Dashwood, who had particular news to give him. Eleanor had begun to write a letter to Edward when she looked up to find him standing in front of her. Her astonishment and confusion were very great. Edward, too, was confused, and for a few moments neither knew what to say to the other. At last, however, the Colonel's offer was made, and Edward, although astonished at this kindness from a stranger, was deeply grateful for the opportunity. He soon realized that he owed more than he could express to Eleanor, and also began to suspect that the Colonel might have a particular reason for wishing to help any friend of hers. There was sadness in his eyes as he rose to say goodbye. "When I see him again," said Eleanor to herself as the door shut behind him, "I shall see him the husband of Lucy." When Mrs. Jennings returned, she was eager to find out more. "Well, my dear, and how soon will the young man be ready?" "In 2 or 3 months, I imagine," replied Eleanor. 2 or 3 months? My dear, how calmly you talk. Can the Colonel wait so long? I know you wish to do a kindness to Mr. Ferrers, but could you not find someone who is already a vicar?" "My dear madam, what can you be thinking of? The Colonel's only intention is to be of use to Mr. Ferrers." "Good heavens, my dear! Surely you do not mean that the Colonel only marries you in order to give £10 to Mr. Ferrers as his vicar's fee for the ceremony?" The confusion could not continue after this, and there was much amusement as Eleanor explained. Mrs. Jennings was just as delighted with the true situation, and looked forward to visiting Lucy and Edward in the vicar's house at Delaford in a few months' time. Eleanor now knew that Edward's marriage to Lucy was certain. She herself had helped to smooth the path towards it. Chapter 9. Marianne's Illness. Before leaving London, Eleanor paid one last visit to her brother and his wife. Fanny did not wish to see her and stayed in her room, but John was very interested in the news of Edward's good luck. He could not understand why the Colonel should give away a living when he could have sold it. But he had something more particular to say to his sister. Taking her hand, he spoke in a very serious whisper. "There is one thing I must say, because I know it will please you. I know, in fact, Fanny heard her mother say, that although perhaps she did not approve of a certain attachment of Edward's, you understand me, it would have been far preferable to her than this engagement to Miss Steele. Of course, all that is quite in the past now and out of the question, but I thought I would just tell you, my dear Eleanor. Not that you have any reason to be sad. There is no doubt of your doing extremely well. Has Colonel Brandon been with you lately?" Eleanor was glad to be spared the need to reply by the entrance of Mr. Robert Ferrers. She had only met him once before, and had found him a thoughtless and insensitive young man, full of his own self-importance. This short meeting only served to support her low opinion of his head and heart. He talked happily of Edward's inheritance, which he would now enjoy, and laughed loudly at the idea of Edward as a poor vicar living in a cottage. "His engagement certainly was very shocking news," he added. "I said to my mother, 'My dear madam, I do not know what you intend to do, but for myself I must say that if Edward marries this young woman, I shall never see him again.' I saw the girl once, you know, just a plain country girl with no elegance or beauty. I cannot help thinking that if I had heard of the connection earlier, I could have persuaded Edward to break it off. But now it is all too late. He must be punished, that is certain." Eleanor was relieved that she could not stay long, and sincerely hoped she would not see Robert Ferrars again. The journey to Cleveland, the Palmers' home in Somerset, took 2 days. Their house was comfortable and modern, with large, well-kept gardens and woods. On her arrival, Marianne went straight into the garden. She was feeling more agitated than usual, aware of being only 80 miles from Barton, and only 30 from Willoughby's country house. But she loved being back in the romantic countryside. She determined to spend as much time as possible taking lonely walks through the gardens and woods. Alone, she would be free to delight in her misery, thinking, dreaming, remembering. The hours passed quietly at Cleveland. Mrs. Palmer had her child, and Mrs. Jennings her sewing. Eleanor was surprised to find Mr. Palmer very capable of being a pleasant companion, and only occasionally rude to his wife and mother-in-law. Colonel Brandon, who was also a guest of the Palmers, spent a great deal of time with Eleanor, talking to her about the vicar's house at Delaford and the repairs he was planning to have done to it. His pleasure in her conversation and his respect for her opinion would have been enough to justify Mrs. Jennings' view of his attachment, and even, perhaps, to make Eleanor suspect it herself. She still felt certain, however, that while he spoke to her, it was Marianne at whom he looked, and of whom he thought. When Marianne mentioned that she had a sore throat and felt unwell, the Colonel appeared extremely worried. In his concern, Eleanor saw the quick feelings and needless alarm of a lover. 2 delightful evening walks in thick wet grass had given Marianne a violent cold. She felt heavy and feverish, with pains all over her body, but at first refused all medicines, saying that a good night's rest was all that she needed. The next day, however, she was worse, unable to do anything except lie miserably on a sofa, and after another restless, feverish night, Eleanor was ready to send for the Palmers' doctor. After examining his patient, he said that she was suffering from an infection and would recover in a few days. But the word infection greatly alarmed Mrs. Palmer, who feared that her baby might catch it, and she persuaded her husband to take her and the child to stay with a near relation until there was no further danger of illness at Cleveland. Mrs. Jennings kindly insisted on staying with the Miss Dashwoods, as she felt responsible for the young ladies in their mother's absence, and Colonel Brandon also offered to stay in case a gentleman's help was needed. Poor Marianne now felt really ill and extremely miserable, as their return to Barton would have to be considerably delayed. Several days passed, and Marianne's condition remained the same. The doctor came every day, talking each time of a speedy recovery, and Eleanor was just as hopeful. In her letters home, she had not told her mother of the seriousness of Marianne's illness, and now congratulated herself on not alarming Mrs. Dashwood unnecessarily. But that evening, Marianne became restless again, and Eleanor stayed beside her bed, watching her turning feverishly from side to side. Suddenly Marianne sat up and cried wildly, "Is Mamma coming?" "Not yet," replied Eleanor, hiding her terror and helping her sister to lie down again. "It is a long way from Barton." "But she must come soon," cried Marianne desperately. "I shall never see her again if she does not come soon." Eleanor was so alarmed that she sent for the doctor at once, and decided to send a messenger to Barton to fetch her mother. She spoke immediately to Colonel Brandon, who, although greatly depressed and fearing the worst, was ready to help in any way, and offered to drive to Barton himself. How grateful Eleanor was for the comfort of such a friend as the Colonel at that moment. Not a second was lost in delay of any kind, and the Colonel drove off into the night, leaving Eleanor to watch over her sister. Both sisters suffered greatly during that night, Marianne in her sleepless pain and fever, and Eleanor in cruel anxiety that her mother would arrive too late to see her dear child alive. When the doctor came, he had to confess that his medicines had failed and that the infection was stronger than ever. Eleanor was calm, except when she thought of her mother, but she was almost without hope. She stayed by her sister's bed all morning, her thoughts confused and sorrowful. But at midday she began to see signs of the fever going down. Cautiously she told herself not to hope, but soon it seemed almost certain. And on the doctor's next visit, he was able to congratulate her on Marianne's slow but sure recovery. Mrs. Jennings showed her delight by talking and laughing without stopping, but Eleanor's feelings were of a different kind. Her relief and happiness were strong, but silent. That evening, Marianne fell into a quiet, comfortable sleep, and Eleanor knew that at last she was out of danger. Her thoughts now began to turn to her mother's arrival, which was expected at any moment. Mrs. Jennings persuaded her to leave Marianne's bedside for a few minutes to drink some tea, but Eleanor soon returned to sit by her sleeping sister and wait for the travellers from Barton. The night was cold and stormy, but as long as Marianne slept peacefully, Eleanor did not mind the beating of the rain on the windows or the noise of the wind blowing round the house. At 8 o'clock, she heard a carriage drive up to the front door. Knowing what her poor mother must be feeling, Eleanor found it impossible to be calm and hurried downstairs. She rushed into the sitting room and saw Willoughby. With a look of horror, she stepped backwards and was about to leave the room, when he said rapidly, "Miss Dashwood, I beg you to stay. I have something I must tell you." Eleanor was astonished. "To tell me?" "Well, sir, if you must. But be quick, I have no time to spare." "Tell me first, is your sister really out of danger?" "We hope she is," replied Eleanor coldly. "Thank God! I heard she was ill, and I have driven all day to get here. I have come to offer some kind of explanation, to show you that I have not always been a scoundrel, and to receive something like forgiveness from your sister." "Marianne has already forgiven you." "Has she?" he cried eagerly. "But listen, I must explain. When I first met your family, I had no other intention than to pass the time pleasantly while in Devonshire. My income was never large, and my debts are always very great, so I was planning to attach myself to a woman of fortune. But I soon found myself sincerely fond of your sister, and the happiest hours of my life were spent with her. I allowed myself, most wrongly, to put off asking her to marry me. At last I determined to speak of marriage, but unfortunately my relation, Mrs. Smith, had just discovered a connection." He reddened and looked away. "But you have probably heard the whole story from Colonel Brandon." "I have," replied Eleanor, also blushing, "and I cannot see how you will explain away your part in that terrible business." "No, I know I was at fault," cried Willoughby, "but I must ask you to believe that I had no idea Eliza was in such need. I suffered too because Mrs. Smith was extremely angry at my behaviour and refused to allow me any more money or see me again. I knew that if I married Marianne I would be poor, and I couldn't bear the thought of that. So I came to Barton Cottage to say good-bye to her. How happy I had been the day before, ready to become engaged to her, and how miserable I was when I saw her sorrow and deep disappointment. Oh, God, what a hard-hearted scoundrel I was." There was a short silence, while Willoughby recovered his self-control, and Eleanor's heart softened a little towards him. "And then, in London, Marianne's notes to me. Every word was a knife in my heart. She was far dearer to me than any other woman in the world, but by then I was engaged to Miss Grey." "Do not speak like that of my sister, Mr. Willoughby," said Eleanor. "Remember that you are a married man now." He began to laugh wildly. "Married, yes. Did you like the letter I wrote to Marianne? Miss Grey happened to see Marianne's last note to me and read it. Her jealous anger made her think of a cruel punishment for me. She told me what to write and watched over me as I wrote the letter. They were all her own gentle words, her own sweet thoughts. I could not risk losing her. I needed her money to pay my debts. You ought not to speak of Mrs. Willoughby in this way. You have made your choice, and should respect your wife. She does not deserve your pity. I have no chance of domestic happiness with her. But do you think me less guilty than before? Will you tell your sister, when she has recovered, what I have told you? If ever, one day, by some happy chance, I were free again—" Eleanor stopped him with a frown. "Well, I shall leave now. I shall live in terror of one event, your sister's marriage. She can never be more lost to you than she is now. But someone else will have her, and if that someone were he whom of all men I could least bear. But I must go. Goodbye." And he almost ran out of the room. Eleanor's heart was full as she returned to her sleeping sister. The past, the present, the future, Willoughby's visit and the pity she felt for him, Marianne's health and her mother's expected arrival, made her so agitated that she did not notice her hunger or tiredness. Only half an hour later, a second carriage arrived at the house. Eleanor hurried to the door, just in time to receive and support her mother as she entered, half dead with fear. In a moment, Eleanor was able to give the good news, and Mrs. Dashwood's tears silently expressed her relief. Colonel Brandon shared her feelings in an even greater silence. In 2 minutes, Mrs. Dashwood was with her suffering child, made dearer than ever by absence, unhappiness, and danger. Marianne's recovery continued every day, and Mrs. Dashwood soon found an opportunity to tell Eleanor another piece of news. On the long drive from Barton to Cleveland, Colonel Brandon had been unable to hide his feelings, and had told Mrs. Dashwood that he had long wanted to marry Marianne. Mrs. Dashwood was now as certain of the Colonel's excellent character as she had once been of Willoughby's, and hoped that Marianne would, in time, come to accept Colonel Brandon's offer of marriage. Chapter 10. Return to Barton. Marianne recovered so well that within a week she was able to travel home, with her mother and Eleanor in Colonel Brandon's carriage. Eleanor was pleased to see that Marianne showed a new firmness of mind and calmness of expression. Although she was clearly still upset when she thought of the past, she was now able to control her feelings and show a cheerful face to her family. She started planning a new life for herself. "When I am stronger, Eleanor, we will take long walks together every day. I shall never get up later than 6, and I shall spend every morning practicing my music or reading." Eleanor smiled, doubting whether this plan would last very long, but happy to see Marianne enthusiastic again. A couple of days later, the weather was so fine that Mrs. Dashwood encouraged Eleanor to take Marianne out for a gentle walk, and the sisters set out along the quiet country road. "There, exactly there," said Marianne, pointing to the hill behind the house, "is where I fell and first saw Willoughby. I am thankful to find that I can see the place with so little pain. Can we talk on that subject now, do you think, Eleanor?" She was affectionately encouraged to speak openly. "I know how badly I have behaved. My illness has given me time to think. I should never have been so incautious in my behaviour with Willoughby, and so impolite to other people. I know now that my own uncontrolled feelings caused my suffering, and even my illness was all my own fault. I have been unkind and unfair to almost everybody I know, but especially to you, dearest Eleanor. Did I follow your example? No. Did I help or comfort you when you were suffering? No. I only thought of my own sorrow and my own broken heart." Eleanor, impatient to calm her, praised her honesty. "I can never forget Willoughby," continued Marianne, but my memories no longer make me miserable. If I only knew that he did not always intend to deceive me, that he had some good in him, I would have much greater peace of mind." Eleanor took a deep breath and passed on to her sister what Willoughby had told her. Marianne said nothing, but tears ran down her face. They were now on their way back to the cottage, and as they reached the door, she kissed Eleanor gratefully, whispered, "Tell Mamma," and went slowly upstairs. When Mrs. Dashwood heard the story, she expressed some pity for Willoughby, but for her nothing could remove the guilt of his behaviour towards Eliza and then Marianne. In the evening, when they were all together, Marianne spoke again of Willoughby. "I wish to tell you both," she told her mother and Eleanor in a trembling voice, "that what Eleanor told me this morning was a great relief to me. I could never have been happy with him after knowing all this." I know," cried her mother. "My Marianne, happy with a scoundrel like that? No." "Marianne, you consider the matter," said Eleanor, "exactly as a sensible person should. And I expect you realise that marriage to him would have involved you in many troubles and disappointments. You would always have been poor, and perhaps your influence on his heart would have lessened, as he realised his selfish demands could not be met." "Selfish? Do you think him selfish?" said Marianne. "Yes, you are right. It is true. How foolish I was." "I am more to blame than you, my child," said Mrs. Dashwood. "I should have discovered his intentions earlier." During the next few days, Marianne continued to get stronger, and life at Barton fell back into the old routines. Eleanor grew impatient for some news of Edward, but the news arrived in a rather unexpected way. Mrs. Dashwood's manservant, Thomas, had been sent to Exeter one morning on business, and on his return finished his report with these words: "I suppose you know, madam, that Mr. Ferrers is married?" Marianne looked quickly at Eleanor's white face and burst into uncontrolled sobbing. Mrs. Dashwood did not know which daughter to take care of first. She and Margaret led Marianne to another room, and then Mrs. Dashwood hurried back to Eleanor, who, although clearly upset, had been able to start questioning Thomas. At once, Mrs. Dashwood took that trouble upon herself. "Who told you that Mr. Ferrers was married, Thomas?" "I saw him myself, madam, with his lady, Miss Steele, as her name was then. Miss Steele called to me from a carriage and asked after the young lady's health. Then she smiled and said she had changed her name since she was last in Devon." "Was Mr. Ferrers in the carriage with her?" "Yes, madam. He was sitting next to her, but I didn't see his face, and Mr. Ferrers isn't a gentleman for talking much." "Did Mrs. Ferrers look well?" "Yes, madam, very well and extremely happy." Thomas was then sent away, and Eleanor and her mother sat in thoughtful silence. Mrs. Dashwood now realised that Eleanor had hidden her feelings for Edward in order to spare her mother any unhappiness. She felt guilty that Marianne's suffering had taken up so much of her time, when her eldest daughter was probably just as much in need of her care and attention. Eleanor herself was extremely miserable. She had always had a secret hope that something might happen to prevent his marrying Lucy. But now he really was married, and she could not bear the thought of it. A few days later, a gentleman was seen riding up to their front door. At first, Eleanor thought it must be Colonel Brandon, but it was not him. In fact, it looked just like Edward. She looked again. It was Edward. She moved away from the window and sat down. "I will be calm. I must be calm." Her mother and sisters had recognised Edward too, but not a word was spoken, and they all waited in silence for their visitor to appear. He entered, looking pale, agitated, and afraid. Mrs. Dashwood greeted him kindly and wished him every happiness. He blushed and said something no one could hear. Eleanor desperately began to talk about the weather. When she had finished expressing her extreme delight in the dryness of the season, a very awful pause took place. It was ended by Mrs. Dashwood, who felt it necessary to hope that Mrs. Ferrars was well. Edward replied hurriedly that she was. Another pause. "Is Mrs. Ferrars in Plymouth?" asked Eleanor bravely. "Plymouth?" he said, surprised. "No, my mother is in London." "I meant," said Eleanor, taking up her sewing from the table, "to ask about Mrs. Edward Ferrars." He blushed, looked puzzled, hesitated, then said, "Perhaps you mean my brother. You mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars." "Mrs. Robert Ferrars?" repeated Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood in the greatest astonishment. Eleanor could not speak. "Yes," said Edward hurriedly. "You may not have heard that my brother is now married to Miss Lucy Steele." Eleanor could sit there no longer. She ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of happiness. Until then, Edward had avoided looking at her. Now he watched her hurry away and seemed to fall into a dream. At last, without saying a word, he got up, left the room, and walked out of the house. Great was the astonishment he left behind him. One thing, however, was certain. Edward was now free, and it was not hard to guess how he would use this freedom. Walking about in the fresh air made him feel brave enough to return, and when they all sat down to tea at 4 o'clock, Edward had won his lady, gained her mother's permission, and was the happiest man alive. His heart was now open to Eleanor, with his weaknesses and mistakes confessed, and his boyish attachment to Lucy discussed with all the wise experience of a man of 24. "My engagement to Lucy certainly was foolish," said he, "but it would not have happened if my mother had allowed me to choose a profession. I had nothing to do, and no friends to advise me, so I imagined myself in love. When I met you, my dear Eleanor, I realized at once how weak I had been." Eleanor's mother and sisters were delighted. They could not love Edward enough, nor praise Eleanor enough. And Eleanor, how can her feelings be described? From the moment of learning that Edward was free, to the moment of his asking her to marry him, her mind was in a storm. But when all doubt was past, and she heard his voice expressing his deep love and affection for her, she knew her happiness was complete. Edward stayed at the cottage for a week, and one of the first subjects of discussion was, of course, Lucy's marriage. It appeared that Robert had visited her several times, trying to persuade her to set Edward free. Lucy had realized that it was now Robert, not Edward, who would inherit his mother's fortune. Being of similarly selfish character, they were attracted to each other and decided to get married with speed and secrecy. Edward's mother was naturally horrified by Robert's marriage. She did not greatly approve of Edward's engagement to Eleanor either, but in the end was persuaded to accept it, and even, rather unwillingly, gave Edward £10,000. She had given the same to Fanny on her marriage. This was much more than was expected by Edward and Eleanor, who could now afford to marry very soon and move into the vicar's house at Delaford. There they were visited by all their friends and relations, who found them one of the happiest couples in the world. Even Mrs. Ferrars came to visit them, although they were never favourites with her. That honour was reserved for Robert and Lucy, who, by endless attentions and respectful messages, finally regained their place in her heart. The whole of Lucy's behaviour in the matter may be seen as a most encouraging example of what self-interest can do to gain wealth and position. With Mrs. Ferrars' generous help, Robert and Lucy lived in great comfort, often visiting John and Fanny Dashwood. Only their frequent domestic disagreements spoiled their happiness. Eleanor's move to Delaford did not separate her from her family, as her mother and sisters spent half their time with her. Mrs. Dashwood was anxious to bring Marianne and Colonel Brandon together, which was also Eleanor's and Edward's wish. Knowing how good, how kind the Colonel was, and how fondly he was attached to her, what could Marianne do? At the age of 17, she had believed that passionate feeling was the most important thing in life. She had had her heart broken and learnt to recover from it. Then, at 19, with feelings of only warm friendship and respect, she agreed to marry a man she had once considered dull and far too old for marriage. But so it was. Colonel Brandon was now as happy as all those who loved him believed he deserved to be, and Marianne, who could never love by halves, came in time to love her husband as much as she had loved Willoughby. Willoughby himself was saddened to hear of her marriage, but he did not die of a broken heart. He even managed to get some enjoyment out of life, as his wife was not always unpleasant, and his home not always uncomfortable. But Marianne remained his idea of the perfect woman, and he often refused to admire a new young beauty as nothing to compare with Mrs. Brandon. Mrs. Dashwood stayed on at Barton Cottage, and as Margaret soon grew old enough for dancing and falling in love, Sir John and Mrs. Jennings did not miss Eleanor and Marianne as much as they had feared. Barton and Delaford were connected by strong family affection, and there was constant communication between the two places. Eleanor and Marianne lived in great happiness, loved and respected by their husbands, and almost within sight of each other. The passing of the years only served to bring them all closer together.